The topics that more landlords and tenants are confused about, and that is the difference between emotional support animals and service animals and pets. So, we are going to go through that process to explain exactly those differences. And we have a special guest today to do that. So, I'm bringing you in, Jarett.
Hey,
Hey,
how's it
Jarett, how
going?
you doing, bud?
Thank you for having me. Great to be
Yep.
here.
So this is Jarett Richards. He is a fellow luxury agent in the office with me at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services. And he's a great guy, has a baseball background. We can talk about baseball if that comes up. But more importantly, he used to work for Ferrari, right? It was Ferrari you worked for.
Yeah, I did all the design configurations for the dealership, and that was a dream job for me. Just like baseball, I could talk cars all day long.
Love it, love it. And real estate.
And real estate.
And
I was going to buy
Jarett
the cars.
Jarett also has the second special guest, and in many cases, the guest that more people want to see. We have Jane Rose, and Jane Rose is an ADA service dog that belongs to Jarett.
Yep.
So let me do some quick housekeeping. Number one, we got Michelle on the line with us, and she's here to help keep things clean in the background. So we appreciate Michelle being here. And we are going to dive in and talk about what is considered a legal issue. But of course, as we always say, we can't give tax or legal advice. So you need to talk to an attorney for your specific situation. So what I'd love to see you do is we're going to run through a few things related to ESA, service animals, and pets. I'd love to get your questions going. So if you're watching this, get your questions going. And of course, some of the topics we're going to cover are going to add potentially to your questions. So let's dive in. You ready, Jarett?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So first thing I want to do is I want to bring up the ADA's website, and it's important. Like Jarett and I were talking about, it's important to understand that there's two different classifications. You have an emotional support animal versus a service animal, and there's also federal requirements that must be met, and then there can be state requirements that must be met. So the first thing, just want to run through quickly. So this is, we'll put this link below so you can take a look at it. So this is the ADA requirements for service animals and how a service animal is defined. So Jarett, you have an ADA certified service animal. So what is the definition for a service animal?
Yeah, so essentially service animal is going to be it's interesting because one thing that I do want to point out is, as you mentioned, federally and state, sometimes, even though it's the same law, sometimes state implies different restrictions and basically procedures, right? And as what they define as a service dog or service animal. In this case, in California, you're going to have service dogs. As you can see on the screen, there's also miniature horses. That's kind of a little separate little provision. So I won't really dive too much into the miniature horses. But a service animal, service dog is going to be a dog that's trained very specifically to do a specific task. So you're going to see in cases where someone needs a guide dog, that is going to be a service dog because that dog is trained specifically to guide that individual place to place. You're also going to have situations. So a little bit about my background without going too much into it.
Yeah, let me back up there. Sorry to interrupt, but
Oh, no, no,
you don't need to share anything personal.
of course.
We
Of
don't
course.
need to, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I just want to get I'd love to get your perspective on this as well. So after we go through this, I want to know what it's like to have a service
Of course.
dog and the misconceptions that are out there too, but we'll get to that. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, don't apologize. I appreciate it. It's pretty much an open book as well. But with her, so I had some issues where she's trained to actually pick up on stress that leads to panic attacks. But more than just panic attacks, because basically with my issues, they wanted to put me on a few different medications that kind of would have just kept me in a zombie type state. So my body's not handling it the same that my mind was. So she's trained to literally pick up on panic attacks. And you often see that service with like veterans with PTSD type of stuff. So to kind of summarize that answer, service dog is going to be trained very specifically for a very specific task to either pick up and identify to alert the owner or to actually help them with their physical task. Then you're going to have emotional supports. So ADA, American Disability Act, that's going to be what Jane is, right? So she's going to have access to go to stores. She's going to be able to go to public places. The other category, I guess, if you will, is going to be emotional support animals. So these are going to be animals that you would be able to take on airplanes. You could take them to hotels, travel, and then you could also live with them. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. These are going to be animals that are still expected to be obedient, but at the same time, they're not going to necessarily be trained to do anything specific. They're really there to provide emotional support, right? Support in that aspect. So you're going to have a service dog that is allowed to go anywhere a business can't restrict it. They're going to have the same, I guess, access that an ESA dog would have when it comes to comes to apartments, comes to housing, comes to travel, and then comes to hotels. But the ADA difference is going to actually allow them to go into a business because they're trained to actually specifically be with that owner. Sometimes they can't be separated, if that makes sense. So
No, and
ability,
that's
service trained, emotional support, emotional only.
bingo, and I think that's a great summary there. The service animal is trained in a specific task or several tasks, whereas the emotional support animal, there isn't necessarily a certification or training program, and that's going to dovetail into what we're going to talk about with what you give to a landlord. So one of the things I want to admit is when I, and this is me being very clear, when I first met you, you came up and introduced yourself when I walked into the office. Confident, uh, good-looking young man, and I saw you with the service dog. My prejudice was, well, why does he have a service dog? There's nothing wrong with him. And
Yeah.
I would imagine that happens to you a lot. It's not always obvious on the outside to a person like me that there may be a need for a service animal.
Correct. Yeah, no,
What
and that's unfortunately something that is expected, right? But at the same time, my philosophy is services don't really like affect anything, so it's kind of to be expected. I know that I'm going to go out there, be confident, and still do what I got to do in my profession. And you're also going to have a lot of the individuals who are essentially going to take advantage of the system,
Yes.
which makes it even more difficult for not only ADA but also ESA, right? Because if you're in a situation where you are a tenant and maybe you saw this during COVID, there's a lot of people that really flock towards their pets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that emotional aspect really was more than just having an animal in the house. It was actually something that provided them emotional comfort and helped them through tough times or whatever that may have been, right? And when you have situations where you go into like a grocery store, right, and you have a dog that's all over the place and barking and stuff like that, because obviously Jane is ADA, so we go into grocery stores and places, and we run into that occasionally. Even in my apartment complex, we ran into essentially in the clubhouse where dogs that shouldn't have been in there are not real, right? And
Well,
that's
and
all funny. Yeah.
just to clarify, not to interrupt, but so Jane, you never have an issue where she's causing a ruckus. She is trained specifically of a well-trained service animal. So she's gone through the certification and or training to be that way, and you keep her on a leash as often as you can. It's actually not required because there are some folks who have a service animal who they can't be leashed because the animal would not be able to do their service,
Mhm.
whatever skill they're trained in. But that's the distinction. You see folks who bring animals and they're just emotional support animals that aren't trained and they're causing a problem. So just as you mentioned.
And with that, it's kind of more my personal opinion on it, but it's interesting because there's actually an identification card, no different than kind of like our ID that she has as well. And the reason why she has that is because we don't have to carry the letter everywhere we go. And the letter of recommendation is actually from your doctor. We'll dive into that in a second.
Yeah.
That's more for housing and that type of stuff. But when we travel, like there's certain forms that have to be filled out now. So they're definitely cracking down on what they're allowed to do. But going back to that card, it's interesting because a business actually cannot just straight up ask, oh, is this a real service dog? Oh, can I see your card? In
Yeah.
my opinion, I don't mind being able to have the business be like, can I see the card just to verify, right? Because then it kind of makes it more, you kind of eliminate those problems. And that's just my personal take on it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting in that way. You have a lot of businesses that are scamming people as well, selling them fake certificates and stuff for emotional support animals and stuff like that. So it is interesting.
And let's dive into that. So that's going to dovetail. So now, like we were talking about, so the ADA requirements are federal. So let's dive into the um, some of the state requirements. And one of the new state requirements, as of January 1st, 2022, it's AB 468. And what it talks about here is emotional support animals. So these aren't they're not certified, or they're not service animals. This is exclusively for emotional support animals. And really the gist of it is that it defines what an emotional support dog or emotional support animal. It does not have special training required to qualify as guide, signal, or service dog. It's not entitled to the rights and privileges accorded by the law that an ADA service animal would be, and knowingly and fraudulently representing oneself to the owner, trainer of any kind. So basically, you can't pretend that it's been trained as such. So this legislation is attempting to crack down on a lot of the fraud out there. It also covers vests and things like that you can buy that say service dog, like Jane Rose has legitimately. You can't be putting those on animals that are not service dogs. And let's now bring in the landlord side of things. So as you mentioned, if you were to go rent an apartment with a service animal, you have a letter for that from your doctor, correct?
Correct. Yeah. The letter's simply going to outline what the disability is, what the purpose of the dog is, and it's also identifying exactly her entire information. Because one thing to note on that is your doctor is actually liable, which correct. So if you walked into your doctor's office and just said, "Hey, I want to make my dog a service dog," and that was all, right? Just you just want to turn your dog into a service dog or emotional support dog, the doctor is actually liable. So if that dog is, because as stated, emotional support does not have to be trained for a very specific task. It still is required to be obedient, and here's where that part comes in play. Let's say that Jane was just an emotional support animal, and let's say that she attacked and bit someone specifically on the complex. Mm-hmm. Well, my doctor, because of the fact that she or he gave the letter of recommendation saying that she is a legit emotional animal that's expected to be obedient and to a still degree of standard, and attack someone, my doctor could actually get sued and lose her license.
That's fascinating.
Lose her license.
Yeah.
Same thing with fascinating.
So people out there, and let's talk more about the ESA, the emotional support animal letters, because this legislation, AB 468, actually touches on it too. So the letter you have for Jane Rose as a service dog is similar to the one that we would need for an ESA, but the ESA requirements in this legislation, obviously fewer people are getting fake service dog letters because there's a high standard you have to meet, and people would figure out pretty quickly whether it really is a service animal theoretically, especially if it's not behaving and not acting in the manner that we all come to expect for service animals. Right. So for what they've done in AB 468 is they've outlined this language in here about the letters for emotional support animals. There was a big problem where folks were going to get these letters the day before they're applying. They're going online just buying a fake letter. So now the healthcare practitioner really has to, the person going for the letter has to be a patient of that healthcare practitioner. They have to know them for at least 30 days prior to providing the documentation. They have to have a valid active license with a license number and the type of professional license in the documentation. And the license has to be within the jurisdiction, which is interesting. So you theoretically, some of these online doctors maybe couldn't give it to you, even if they waited the 30 days, because they're not in the same jurisdiction. But who knows? Maybe they figured a way around that. And you actually have to undergo a clinical evaluation of the individual. So, and again, it's a crime if it's done knowingly or fraudulently misrepresenting. So this legislation attempted to clean that up to make it easier, really, at the end of the day, to help keep people honest and to make it easier for landlords to understand what they're getting into. And I think it's time to jump into that. So landlords have to accept service animals with the appropriate documentation,
Correct.
and landlords have to accept emotional support animals with the appropriate documentation, which would be the letter we just discussed that's laid out in AB 468. So
Just to hop into, which also waives the fee. So if your landlord is charging like a 500 deposit per animal, that fee is also waived.
that's great. Yeah, and that's a good distinction right there, what you just said for the animal. So service animals and emotional support animals are not pets, and that's an important distinction. Pets, you can charge a pet fee, additional rent, or you can charge a pet deposit that you hold on to as a landlord. Some landlords try to charge both. I'm not a fan of charging both. You pick one or the other, but it's you do what you want to do as a landlord as long as it's within the law. So you basically cannot charge the increased deposit or a pet fee for an emotional support animal or a service animal. And I think that's an important thing for landlords to understand. One thing we discussed yesterday when we were going through this, Jarett, is it isn't just when people are applying that they can get an emotional support animal or service dog. So delve into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, to that point, let's use COVID for example, right? Because we just went through this. So for sure, there would have been a lot of people that were tenants already. We're not talking about new tenants, that are already tenants, and then they went through the process. And as long as they go through the proper process that Christian just outlined, and have the proper letter and documentation and everything, right? They actually qualify for a service dog, or in some cases, an actual emotional service animal in that case.
Yeah.
So they don't have to be first-time tenants, first-time renters, or like new tenants. I mean, they could actually be pre-existing tenants that have rented for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be. And as long as they have everything, you as a landlord would have to honor that.
No, and that's an important distinction. And what I will say too, particularly Los Angeles, for example, in Los Angeles, if you brought a pet in during COVID, LA City, you still can't be evicted for that for at least until February of 2024 for an unauthorized pet. So really what could happen is that unauthorized pet could become an ESA, you could get a letter for that animal as an emotional support animal, and then the landlord would not be able to evict for that ESA. Let's talk about, so the service animal side of things, we saw that definitely dogs can be service animals, miniature horses, which is, I haven't seen one, but I'd love to see that. Have you seen a miniature horse?
I've seen one miniature horse and two emotional service digs.
That's spectacular. You did show me that one picture of the pig. I love that picture. It would be great if we could pull that up. But
The horses is interesting, though, or because they're kind of technically ponies, right? Because miniature horses, so there's like a size requirement, and it's a separate provision, but it's very specific as to what will qualify a miniature horse for being an actual service pet.
Well, yeah, it's here on the ADA's website. It's oh, well, here's what's interesting. So they have to be miniature, but here it says miniature horses generally range from 24 to 34 and generally weigh between 70 and 100 pounds. So it's not necessarily that they're requiring it, but they're saying that, like, if you got a horse that's 5 feet tall, that's not a miniature horse anymore. So that's an interesting distinction. One other thing. So let's talk about emotional support animals, because another issue out there for landlords is what types of animals can be emotional support animals. So I want to hear, you just mentioned pigs. What else have you seen? I know you showed me one yesterday that I'll pull up right now.
Yeah, I won't spoil the surprise on that one. I'll let you pull that one now. But it's interesting because of the fact that if you were to go back in a couple years ago, I think you said that AB 468 took place January of 22, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, correct.
So even if you go before 22, then you would have situations of, and some of your viewers watching this may have actually been on a plane and have seen a bizarre type of emotional animal on an airplane, right? So it depends on the state, because federally speaking, obviously, an emotional support animal is not necessarily restricted to just dogs. So you could have the situation where you have an emotional support snake, reptile. You could have a situation where, which I have, yep.
Here you go.
Uh,
Emotional support alligator. And we are not laughing at the fact that somebody needs an emotional support alligator. That's not why we're laughing. It is great. That's that, and you showed me this, Jarett, and you
yeah,
showed me the video footage. And this alligator was actually very happy to be with the family and have its belly rubbed.
with all the kids and everything, just.
So that's and I. What were you going to add? Sorry, go ahead, bud.
No, basically, I was just going to say it kind of just outlines like really what an emotional support animal is, and it varies on each state's regulations on how they define that. Because if you look at that situation, because like key thing, like you said, right, we're not laughing at the fact that individual needs an emotional support alligator. It's just it's cool to see, and a little funny at the same time as far as it's an alligator, right? It is what it is, but it's that aspect of that companionship, where just that emotional aspect, right? Whereas an ADA dog is actually going to be a dog trained very specifically for diabetes and alerting and that type of stuff, right? So
Yeah,
going back to the question, I've seen emotional support birds. I've seen emotional support hamsters, guinea pigs. I've seen
I love
like
it.
lizards. Like, yeah, it's interesting, right? But obviously the reptiles are a little bit more interesting because
They're
it,
less cuddly. You assume
it,
cuddly, but that's my prejudice in
but
it.
cats too, right? Their
Yeah,
cats are definitely a great example, because if you look at the more common ones, it's usually going to be dogs and cats
yeah,
for the most part, right? But birds could fall in that place too. I've seen emotional support parrots.
yes.
So it varies very. Sorry, I can't talk right now. It varies depending on the state regulation, of course, as far as what they really define it as. I know airlines are cracking down, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
So even though that she's ADA and also ESA, when we travel, you're actually going to be filling out a form. The forms are different ever so slightly. Hers is actually outlining what her disability is. And to kind of also touch on the travel aspect, for anyone that may be in a situation where they're dealing with some tough time, stress, whatever it may be, and you're looking for an emotional support animal and kind of how that process works, it's essentially housing. As we mentioned, landlord will have to allow that even if they don't allow pets. Breed restrictions. There's no breed restrictions actually with dogs. So you could have an emotional support pit bull. You could have an emotional support Chihuahua, Great Dane, boxer. It very much so varies, right? So for
That's a
instance, the
great point.
complex that I'm at, they don't allow, or they didn't at one point allow German shepherds. Well, obviously she's purebred shepherd. Well, even if she was just ESA, she has ADA clarification. But even if she was just ESA, she would still have to be allowed into the complex with me, and they wouldn't be able to charge a fee. So there's no breed restrictions really on that aspect. But I do know airlines are starting to crack down on what kind of animal, I guess it is,
For
which I
emotional
think
support.
rightfully so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I appreciate you bringing that up about no breed restrictions, because that's going to be a question some landlords have. And another question I've had landlords have is there a restriction on the type of animal? And one landlord had that I know, she told me the story about her tenant had an emotional support rooster, and they supposedly had a certification letter. Now, this was before AB 468, so maybe it wasn't a legitimate letter, but maybe it was. Maybe they really needed the emotional support rooster. It's not for us to judge. The problem is that rooster every morning does what a rooster does, and when the sun comes up, it starts cockle-doodle-doo.
Good morning.
So it's making all of the. Can you do a better cockle-doodle-doo than that? Do you?
Oh no, I'll leave that one.
All right, good. So what that ended up happening is that emotional support animal became a nuisance for other neighbors in her building and then neighboring buildings as well. So that was one way in this case that she was able to have them remove their emotional support rooster because it was a nuisance, and they were allowed to replace it with an animal that wouldn't be a nuisance, like maybe a chicken, because a chicken doesn't cockle-doodle-doo in the morning. But no, seriously, you can replace it with another animal. But it's not carte blanche. You couldn't have an elephant. You couldn't have certain other animals like that just logistically wouldn't fit, and there's no reasonable accommodation. So I think that's an important distinction as well, that there has to be a reasonable attempt to accommodate by the landlord the animal, but it isn't an endless list of animals that can come in. I mean, another example, in California, ferrets are illegal apparently, so you couldn't have an emotional support ferret without breaking California law. So that's another example.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at questions, and it doesn't look like we have many questions, just because we are being so darn thorough, and you are bringing so much information, Jarett. I appreciate that, bud.
No.
Anything else you want to add before we head out?
Let's see. As far as I guess anyone that is looking for the process, what I would recommend, if you're in the situation where you're like, I'm a tenant, maybe not, but I'm looking for an emotional support animal. What is the best way to do it? Because kind of going back into that aspect of there's a lot of businesses that are scamming some people that actually legitimately need this. My recommendation is to actually just go straight to your doctor and talk to them. Because
great.
essentially you're talking about a doctor letter recommendation. So there's some organizations that they do specialize in emotional support and service animals, but just because of the fact that there's so many fraudulent companies out there, I recommend go directly to your doctor, get their advice on how to best proceed with the aspect. Because going back to kind of also the 30-day aspect, I think they implemented that for the same reason that it allows a doctor to actually properly diagnose the situation, properly understand the animal. Because going back to that point, the doctor is indeed liable. So that's one thing that I would point out is that thing. So, and then for I guess anyone that's watching, that's a business, and you're dealing, or actually even like a landlord or property management company, because we ran into this situation in the clubhouse, like I mentioned, at our complex, where we were in the complex. And to be clear, just because your emotional support animal is allowed to live with you, that still does not give them the access to public places such as the clubhouse on the facility. So the clubhouse that we're at, they don't allow dogs into the building. Jane and I were walking through, and this lady had her little dog off leash that ran up to us. We probably did like 6 circles, and then Jane is trained to handle and not react to those types of situations, of course, and so she did wonderful. But like after like the 5th little circle around, she finally took her paw and just pushed the thing, and I was okay with it. I was like, okay with it. But the lady comes walking in, and like this little dog had like a service vest on and everything, and she's like, oh, like no big deal, right? And the thing that I want to point out is, as the property manager rightfully did, in that situation, the dog is like you said, a nuisance. It's an issue. If your dog is not obedient and disruptive, they have a legal right to be able to ask you to remove the dog from the premises, regardless of the fact that it's your emotional support animal. And of course, she had an issue with it and stuff like that. Well, going back into my point that I wish that it was allowed actually for people to say, hey, can I check your ID just to make sure that she's legit? I don't think it's discriminating. I think it's just kind of filtering out the scams and stuff like that. But because they're not allowed to, what you are able to ask is, what is the dog trained to assist you with?
Got it.
So those types of like that question is allowed. So like if we go into a restaurant, I mean, there's times where I walk in, and like you said earlier, I'm expecting it. I dress a certain way and I look a certain way on the inside, right? So I expect people to be like, oh, that's probably a guy taking advantage of the system. That's not a real service dog. So that we sometimes get asked that question, oh, where's she trained for? Which I never mind sharing, that she's trained to pick up on internal issues that lead to panic attacks that basically leads to internal bleeding. And so she alerts me to go somewhere else, right? That I don't mind explaining. So those types of questions you are allowed to ask. And if the dog's being, or whatever animal it is being disruptive, you are allowed to. So that's one thing that I would say also to kind of advocate on business owners, property managers, and landlords as well.
Jarett, that was spectacular what you shared, and what it does too. What it should resonate for those who have emotional support animals to be more careful with their emotional support animal, because that example you shared where that dog was creating a nuisance, what it does is it gives a bad name to all the dogs, service and emotional support. It gives a bad name to others who have their emotional support animal in check in their apartment, not in a place where it shouldn't be. And that is spectacular what you just shared. People really, in order to keep the ability to have emotional support animals for those who truly need it, you have to follow the rules for the emotional support animals and not ruin it for everybody else. And I think that's great what you're sharing. And I wish we had more questions come in because you are a wealth of knowledge on this. I'm so glad I had you come on and discuss this topic. And this will obviously stay up so others can listen to it. And
one thing that I'll do too is once this is posted, I'll go through every now and then and just check for comments.
Thank you.
If there's any questions, of course, let me know. We're in the same Berkshire, but if I see questions and when it's posted, I'll do my best to be able to answer it.
I appreciate that. And if you guys are looking for a luxury real estate agent, you obviously have me, but you also have Jarett, and he's a hardworking guy. And I encourage you to reach out to one or both of us if you're looking for real estate help. That's how I put food on the table. And Jarett is definitely someone that you can trust and that'll work hard for you. That's why he's on my show. I'm not going to have any goofballs on my show and sharing information. So,
thank you.
yeah. All right. I'm going to just finish up with the last few things. Jarett, thank you again, bud. You were amazing.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
I learned so much from this that I didn't know. And now I feel like I can provide better service in real estate because of you. So thank you, bud.
Oh, yeah, that makes me happy. That was the goal. Again, thanks for having me on.
All right. So thanks for watching, you guys. That was amazing to hear what Jarett shared about service animals and emotional support animals. Hopefully that clears up some of your questions, whether you're a tenant or a landlord, on whether you're allowed to have animals. What I encourage most landlords to do, the landlords I represent, some landlords will say no pets, absolutely no pets. If you know as a landlord that you could be given a letter, a legitimate letter for a service animal or an emotional support animal, I would say, why not just accept animals, period? You never know if you're going to have emotional support animals or service animals, why not open it up to everyone? The one advantage to only allowing service animal and emotional support animals is theoretically they are better trained. So that would be one reason maybe you don't want to open it up to everybody. But I'm glad we have AB 468 in place now to help fine tune the process of getting letters for emotional support animals and some of the other gear for emotional support animals that's out there. So that is, wait, Jarett, do you have something you want to bring up again? You're back in.
I'm back in. I'm back
I love
in.
it. I love it. What do you got, bud?
You just made. So essentially, if you are a landlord and you do open it up to animals, even if they're emotional supports, ADA, or non-service animal, I guess in that case, all three people, if the dog does cause any type of damage, they're still essentially going to be liable for that.
Thank you for sharing. That was one of the questions. So it doesn't matter from highly trained service animal or miniature horse on down. If there's damage from the pet, the tenant is liable and it comes from their security deposit. Excellent. Correct. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I'm kicking you out again. That was great. Great point. Thanks. So thank you for that again, Jarett. And then one thing I'll share with you guys, we will be, there's our emotional support alligator again. Let us know in the comments below what other animals you see out there for emotional support. That's fascinating to me. And one of the other things I want to let you know is we're going to be at the Income Property Management Expo. That is coming up in about 2 weeks. It is free to register, and you can find a link below to attend that. It's free. It'll be on the 23rd of May. We'll be there in a prime spot as you walk in the door. Look to your right. Unfortunately, I won't have Jarett with me, but if you have a question for Jarett, meet me at the show and we can call him right there and we can do a video call and ask him. But I will have Kenny, the attorney, there for any questions you have as a landlord. So I appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to our free weekly email newsletter. We have that below so that you don't miss out on updates like these, whether you're a tenant or a landlord or a buyer or seller. And if you know anybody looking to buy or sell in Southern California, we have a regional sales and marketing office in Orange County and LA now. We're covering all of Southern California. So you can reach out. We have a link below so you can do that. Thanks for tuning in. We want to hear from you. Make sure you leave those